Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks to the postdocs who invited me, the postdocs who do enormous, really, with the graduate students, do all the work here at Caltech. It's not the faculty. And thanks to you who all have to come to this great event to take a day, a beautiful weekend day, to think about science. So as Amir just told you, I'm actually a neuroscientist and also a biomechanician, somebody who's interested in applying physical principles to how bodies and brains work. But today I want to talk, after that wonderful previous talk, thinking about the universe and galaxies, I want to kind of bring things back home and remind you all that insects are the most successful group of organisms in the history of life on this planet, perhaps every planet. We don't know that. There's somewhere between 6 and 30 million species of insects. And my favorite type of insect is a fly. Now, you might think of flies as the annoying little things that come into your kitchen or visit you when you're taking your dog for a walk or take the garbage out. But flies are actually the most ecologically diverse group of insects. There's about 100,000 different kinds of flies, and they all have different lifestyles. They're all often very, very colorful. But I want to talk to you, well, this is one of my favorite flies. This is a fruit fly. This is a high-speed video of two flies on a collision course that do this elegant maneuver in order to keep from crashing into one another. And this entire sequence took place in about 200 milliseconds, a fraction of a human eye blink. And most of what I study in my laboratory is how the brain and body of this creature works in order to produce these elegant behaviors on such a fast temporal scale. But today I want to talk about something quite different, and it's about another type of fly, a fly that is only found in Mono Lake, just east of Yosemite National Park. Has anybody here been to Mono Lake? Okay, so you may have seen the creatures that I'm going to talk about. They're the guys on the top, not the guys on the bottom. The guys on the bottom are penguins. The guys on the top are the so-called alkali flies or Mono Lake flies. And the reason that I have a picture of a penguin is that these flies basically have turned themselves into penguins, and that, like penguins, they forage underwater. And in order to do so, they have to undercome some rather remarkable physical adaptations. So Mono Lake is a lake in this great basin region of the western United States, where water flows in from the snowmelt of the mountains, from the mountains every year, but it does not flow to the sea. So it continues to evaporate over millions and millions of years. And this is, by the way, a picture of my postdoc, Floris von Bruegel, who did a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today. He and I did this project together. Mono Lake is a very beautiful place. It is a very, very salty place. Because of this constant evaporation, the salt content of Mono Lake is about 3 times that of the Pacific Ocean. And it is also very, very basic. That is to say, it has a very, very, very high pH. And because of this extreme chemistry, the saltiness and the alkaline nature of the water, very few things can live in it. Fish cannot live in this lake. There are no fish living in this lake. There are really just 3 things. Alga. So the lake is, if you've ever been there, you'll notice that it's somewhat green in color. Brine shrimp that slurp up all the alga. And the other thing are flies. Now, can you see all the flies? Can you see all the flies? Let's take a look in this little square here. That's what the surface of the lake looks like. So all that brown stuff you saw on the surface of the lake was not sand, but flies. And so if you take a high-speed video camera to the surface of the lake, this is what you'll see, these squadrons of hundreds of millions of flies all flying around. But it's not the flight behavior of these animals that makes them so interesting. It's what they do underwater. There's so many flies that gulls, like this California gull, can forage simply by opening their mouth and running through the flies. and you can see this. You can go to YouTube and see lots of wonderful videos of this behavior. And I'll get back to birds in a little bit later. Actually, right now. Well, technically it was later. the brine shrimp and the flies are critical for many, many, many species of birds, especially the California gull, the ear-greeb, Wilson's phalarope, depend upon the vast amount of food available in the lake during their yearly migration. So this is a very critically ecologically important part of the western United States. Once upon a time, they were important not only for birds, but also for people. There was a tribe of Native Americans called the Kutsikadika, that's about as good as I can do, that was translated into fly eaters. These people subsisted on the pupae of sort of the caterpillars, just like caterpillars and butterflies. Flies are little tiny crawly creatures called maggots when they're young. They form a pupae that then turns into an adult. And the native peoples would harvest the pupae from the lake with, unfortunately, there are no longer any members of this tribe, but a lot of their artifacts remain. These food stuff was so valuable that they would trade it all the way to the western coast of California. Now, how do the flies get to such high population densities? Well, they've evolved the habit of actually crawling underwater. And here's a fly crawling down a surface of a rock, and now it's under the surface of the water, surrounded by a silvery bubble. And there's a little brine shrimp saying hello. They have these fantastic claws that look like an X-Men character. And these are used to actually keep hold of the rocks as they crawl underwater. When they want to come back up, they just let go with their claws, float to the surface. The bubble opens up, and they fly away. And you can go to Mono Lake and see this happening. It's not one of those things like a David Attenborough movie where he shows, a cheetah catching a gazelle, and you go to Africa, and of course you never see anything that exciting. But you can actually go see these exciting things just by going to Mono Lake. So why did I bring up Mark Twain in my talk? Well, Mark Twain was the first person who described these flies. And I just want to read his quotes that were from his book, Roughing It, that he wrote in 1847. You can hold them underwater as long as you please. They do not mind it. They are only proud of it. When you let go of them, they pop off to the surface as dry as a patent office report and walk off as unconcernedly as if they had been educated especially with a view to affording instructive entertainment to man in that particular way. Now, I wish scientific papers were written as well as this. It'd be a lot more fun to read. So Twain was the first person to describe the behavior of these remarkable flies. And as a scientist, Floris von Bruegel and I were just interested in a number of the questions. How do the flies crawl under the surface of the water without getting wet? And how do they come back to the surface as dry as a patent office report? So we built a bunch of equipment and set up a field site on the shores of Mono Lake, which we returned through several times. And we built a little gizmo in which we would glue a fly to a sensor, push the fly under the surface of the water while measuring the force required to do so. And then we'd also take the fly back up out of the water to the air surface, recording any forces that the fly recovered during this process. And so I'm not going to show you a lot of data in this presentation, but this is what the data would look like. And this is the force required that the fly has to generate with its legs and body to push through the surface tension of the water until it forms a bubble around it and takes about 18 times its body weight in force to pull itself under the water. And now it's crawling around underneath the water with a little bubble surrounding it. And then when it comes back to the surface, it actually can recover some of that force. So it actually really does pop through the air-water interface as it emerges. And we could actually record the amount of work that was recovered during this process. But the really fascinating thing about the fly's lifestyle is that there is a lot of sodium bicarbonate in Mono Lake because of the local geometry. Sodium bicarbonate you can buy in a grocery store. It's actually sold for as washing soda. Um, but chemically, the sodium bicarbonate makes Mono Lake very, very wet. Now, I know that sounds crazy. It's already water. It's already wet. Like, who is this guy? How did he get a professorship at Caltech? But because of peculiarities of sodium and carbonate ions, what happens when these ions are right at an air-water interface is they create a little zone of negative charge. And that negative charge interacts with positive charges, say, on your body or the surface of the fly, that attracts the water to the surface. So if you've ever go swimming in Mono Lake, which I don't recommend, it's a horrible thing to do, but it's kind of a neat experience. But you'll feel it's almost as if the water is oily because it sticks to you so readily. So what I'm going to show you is a little movie of bubbles of pure water pushing up against the wing of a fly. And they'll come, it's 9 different experiments. And you'll see that the water has a very difficult time wetting the surface of the fly wing. Now I'll show you the same experiment now with sodium bicarbonate in the water drop. And you'll see that the water tends to stick to the surface of the wing. So this is what I mean by the Mono Lake water being particularly wet. So this is a problem for the fly because as it goes through the air-water interface underneath the water, if its body gets wet, it gets stuck and it can't get up again, can't get out again. But Mono Lake flies are uniquely specialized to form these bubbles so that when they come back up out of the water, they're perfectly dry. If you compare that to this poor kelp fly, you'll see that it's not, no flies were harmed in the filming of this, I just want to say. But this poor fly that lives on the coast of California, so it's used to salty waves, but if its body gets covered with this Mono Lake water, it's completely wet. So how is it that these flies remain dry? Well, they have a property called hydrophobicity, which is sometimes called the lotus effect. The lotus effect, which was first described for the process by which lotus leaves remain dry, is that droplets of water have a difficult time contacting surfaces that are covered with fine, fine, fine hairs. So when a water droplet comes in contact with such a surface, it could be in one of either 2 states, the so-called Wenzel state or the Cassie-Baxter state. You don't have to worry about those terms. But they prefer this Cassie-Baxter state where there's little tiny pockets of air remain between the hairs on the surface. And it turns out that the Mono Lake flies are very, very hairy flies. And we quantified this very, very, very carefully. So they're the hairiest flies on the planet that we know of. And this helps keep them dry as they go under the water. In addition, within this bubble, remember there are these sodium and carbonate ions that create this negative zone in the water that is attracted to positive charge on the fly. The other thing the flies do is they cover themselves with sort of an oily wax that tends to mask this positive charge. And so in essence, what the flies are doing is they're hairy. They use specialized waxes and oils and lotions. So we call this the hipster adaptation that allow the flies to dive under the water, taking a little air bubble with them, and then popping back to the air when they so choose. So I just want to end the talk. You've gotten a lot of great advice about how to do science, how to become a science, how to prepare for a life of science. But I just want to give a slightly different message, is that one of the things that we scientists also have to do is take care of this one planet that we've been given. And what's being shown in this little GIF is approximately 50 years of photographs of the same feature, one of these so-called Tufa towers at Mono Lake. So I'll just let it scroll by. So in the 60s, it was barely above the surface of the water. And as the time has gone by, you can see that structure is now surrounded by dry land because the surface of the lake has decreased. Does anybody know why the lake has gone down? Why? Evaporation. And that's part, but you know why, even more important reason? Why? Yeah, let me give you a little hint here. this is where it's gone. The city of Los Angeles has basically taken the water that would normally fill the lake. So when Mark Twain went to the lake, he said, you can see there is a belt of flies an inch deep and 6 feet wide, and this belt extends clear around the lake, a belt of flies 100 miles long. It's not that big anymore. The population of flies are declining, and so are the birds. So this very, very sad photograph was one that Flores and I took during one of our trips when, during the drought, remember the drought a few years ago, we found hundreds, if not thousands, of eared grebe skeletons around the lake because there weren't enough flies and brine shrimp for them to eat. The population took a devastating crash that year. And unfortunately, this is not just happening at Mono Lake. These are data that were published about a year ago by a group in Krefeld, Germany, of a 30-year study just measuring the biomass of insects throughout Europe. And what they found is that over the last 29 years, which is almost exactly the amount of time that I have been a scientist, there's a 75% decline in insect biomass. Just to put this in perspective, over the same 30-year period, there's been a 13% rise in atmospheric CO2. And what we're beginning to learn of scientists is that the real problem, and even if you don't love insects, you probably love things that eat insects, like birds and mammals. And birds and mammal populations are declining largely because they're running out of things to eat. So you might have heard of certain species that are declining be described as, a canary, the canary in the coal mine, which is sort of indicating that, things aren't going well. Well, this isn't the canary in the coal mine. This is the whole damn coal mine, which is declining if we lose insects. So I hate to end on such a pessimistic note. I'm glad you're all here. I'm so glad and enthralled that you have an interest in science. But I think one of the things that we scientists have to do, in addition to following our curiosity, is being fantastic stewards of the natural world and the physical world that we've been we have the pleasure of studying. So basically, I want you to sort of think before you swat next time. And use some of the great wisdom and knowledge that you acquired in your education to ensure that we leave a world for a younger generation that is worthy of study. So thank you very much for your time.